Hi, glad to see you on my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. Have a good view. It was the 50s. We survived as best we could. After the fall of the Nazi regime and the surrender of Germany, Wehrmacht soldiers who had been through the war had to survive in the difficult post-war years, when their country literally resembled a pile of stones. The price for losing the total war declared by the Nazis to the world was high. There was no housing, work, food, and the German territory was occupied by the victors, the troops of the anti-Hitler coalition countries. The surviving submariners who were allowed to return from captivity in 1946-1947 first had to search for relatives, many of whom had died during the war, and then adapt to the difficult conditions of life in post-war Germany. Naval officers had no civilian professions. They were not in demand as specialists, as defeated Germany actually had no naval forces until 1955, when the newly formed FRG and GDR had the opportunity to establish their own navies. There were no vacancies in the merchant navy either, because the German merchant navy was barely breathing after war losses and reparations. There were very few ships. Former naval officers joined the Navy when they were 17 years old and received a very good naval education, but it was practically useless in peacetime. Of course, they had not had time to learn a profession before joining the Navy, so they had no opportunity to return to their former jobs. They simply did not exist. Their prolonged captivity was the other side of the double-edged sword of unemployment. Some were able to learn a profession in captivity, but when they returned to Germany, the good jobs were already filled. The officers and lower ranks of the Kriegsmarine Corps of Engineers fared somewhat better than the commanders, because in the market economy of a war-torn country, their skills as mechanics were in demand. Few of the available jobs could be obtained through official employment. The black market flourished in the country, but they had to live on something, and sailors had to grab any job. For example, the famous diving ace Eric Topp managed to get a job as a sailor on a small fishing trawler, and his colleague Ernst Bauer worked as a clerk in the office of a small company. But it was not only the lack of work in Germany that made the situation of the former submariners difficult. For several years after the war, Germans were restricted in many ways, including the right to leave the country, making it impossible for them to go abroad in search of work. Therefore, Germany was often left illegally. Some of the submarine officers, such as Hans Dietrich Freiherr von Tiesenhausen, managed to emigrate to the United States, England, Canada, and other countries. But this was possible only if a citizen of that country, a friend or a relative, could vouch for the future emigrant. Some submariners, being in captivity, managed to get acquaintances from local residents who issued them a call, or had relatives who lived there before the war. A certain number of submariners decided to associate their future life with the French Foreign Legion. Another motive for leaving the country was the dire food situation. Those who received food parcels from friends and relatives in other countries were considered lucky in Germany. Paradoxically, former opponents and even victims of German submariners literally fed the latter. Thus, the German submarine ace Otto von Bülow received food parcels from crew members of the American ship he sank. The commander of the British corvette HMS Crocus, John Ferdinand Holm, who nearly sank U-333, Peter Eric Kremer in the brutal battle off Freetown on October 6, 1942, sent food parcels to the latter's mother in Germany. The most successful of the submarine officers who found work tried to continue their education to increase their relevance in the labor market. For example, the same Eric Topp studied architecture and worked in the profession until 1958. Ernst Bauer and several other submarine commanders returned to the Navy in 1955. But the freshly created FRG Navy was tiny, and the number of officers willing to serve in it knowingly exceeded the need for personnel. Therefore, very few were invited to serve, and the rest had to continue to realize themselves in the civilian life and came to the Bundesmarine much later. A separate aspect of the survival of submariners in post-war Germany was the Navy's mutual support, formed during the years of study of future officers at the Naval School in Merwick. The sense of camaraderie was especially evident among the enlisted officers' peers. So-called crews for naval service were formed in pre-war Germany according to years of enlistment, and officers from the same enlistment were the most united. Surviving classmates helped each other in any way they could. According to naval tradition, the most senior officer of his enlistment was obliged to organize help to his comrades and their wives, widows, children. Therefore, as soon as officers of one crew met, they tried to help each other as much as possible, notifying about vacancies, finding accommodation, writing recommendations and petitions, etc. If someone was sick or in distress, the whole crew would rush to his aid and try to support him. Who became what? In the first edition of Harold Bush's book, That Was the Submarine War, from 1952, a list of former German submarine aces was published, listing their professions at the time. It is interesting because it allows us to familiarize ourselves, at least partially, with what former submariners were doing before 1955. Based on contemporary data, this list was also supplemented with other submarine officers, thus expanding it to almost 30 people. It is noteworthy that among these men, masters of destruction in war, such fields of activity as construction and architecture were popular. However, this should not be surprising. In war-torn Germany, construction specialties were in great demand. Many people went into private business, and some achieved good success in this field. The word businessman should not be taken to mean a big businessman or an industrialist. In post-war Germany, many people were considered businessmen if they traded in shoelaces. A submarine ace from the GDR. Not all famous submariners remained in the western part of the country after Germany's surrender. As it turned out, one of them ended up in the East and lived out his life as a citizen of the GDR. This is Heinrich Liebe, occupying the fourth line in the list of the most effective submarine aces of Nazi Germany. Becoming a prisoner of war in May 1945, he was liberated by the Allies in 1947. According to some reports, he was then repatriated by the Allies to the east. According to others, he returned to the territory of East Germany, to the zone of Soviet occupation. There he ended up in his hometown of Gotha in Thuringia, where his parents lived. After the outbreak of the Cold War, Liebe found himself in the GDR. It is not difficult to assume that such a well-known figure could not remain unnoticed by the new authorities. According to anecdotal evidence, the former ace repeatedly received offers to join the armed forces of the GDR, but invariably refused. As punishment for this, Liebe was taken on a pencil and did not give him normal work in the civilian sphere. He was allowed to do only the lowest paid jobs with no career prospects. There are reports that Liebe worked as a janitor, gardener, and even as an acolyte of the local church. Liebe lived almost all the rest of his life under socialism, being a citizen of the GDR, but he survived the fall of the Berlin Wall and died in July 1997 in United Germany. Interestingly, his colleague, former watch officer of boats U-1206 and U-3514, Oberleutnant zur See Friedrich Elklepp, made a career in the Volksmarine, becoming a rear admiral and deputy commander of the GDR Navy. In conclusion, I would like to note that the submariners underwent strict intellectual, physical, and psychological selection and were able to withstand in conditions of extreme stress. Those who survived the depth bombs in the Atlantic did not fare as well in the face of the devastation, hunger, and unemployment of the first post-war decade. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. See you soon.